Welcome to Money and Freedom, the podcast where you learn to become financially free using value investing. Welcome to my podcast. This is my very first podcast. You can consider it like an introduction to what I'm going to do and who I am. So this podcast series is about value investing. Now, what is that? More specifically, it's about how to become financially free, or even better, how to create generational wealth through stock market investing. This is what we're going to talk about. But in this very first podcast, I'm going to talk about me. Who am I? My name is Bejle Grünbaum. I'm going to tell you about how I got so interested in value investing, what triggered me. I'm also going to talk about some of the things that I learned. But more importantly, I'm going to give you some key takeaways. What can you get out of this? Around 5 things that you can take away from my journey. Okay, so first of all, who am I? I am Bejle, as I told you. I was born in Denmark. I'm going to go way back to who my family is, because this is part of what has motivated me, of what made me so interested in this topic. So I was born in Denmark. My parents were very old, so they both survived the Second World War. My dad, now hold on to your chair for a moment if you're sitting down. If you're not sitting down, please sit down. He was 65 when I was born. So he was actually a young man during World War II. And he was a Jew and he was a communist. So he was pretty much in trouble. My mom was also alive during the Second World War, but she was just a little girl. She was 43 when I was born. And her dad was also a communist. That's actually how they got to know each other, my mom and my dad, through my mom's dad, through the communist movement, and through, everything around the war and after the war, the resistance movement. Okay, so I grew up in a household that was communist and that was very affected by the war. And just a little bit about what actually, because you're probably wondering what happened to them. So my dad had to go underground, and he didn't. Most Jews fled the country. They went to Sweden. He didn't. He went into the resistance movement, and this had some huge implications that I did not realize before, actually 2 years ago. So he had a family with young children, and these children were placed because his wife followed him for some reason. She didn't stay with the children. So these 2 children, one went into an orphanage and the other one went into another family. And they didn't tell him. He was only 2 years old, so less than 2 years. He didn't have a language yet. So he grew up in this family for around 5 years. And he didn't know that family was not his family. He thought it was his family. He doesn't know. He's still alive today. He doesn't know why they didn't tell him. And he thinks it's because they were afraid that, as children do, he might, say it to someone else. So he grew up in a family that he thought was his family. And then one day when the war's over, my dad turns up at the door of this family and says, "Hello, I am your father." And he looked really weird because he had tried to hide that he was Jewish, so he colored his hair. He wanted they had to be red, but it turned out green. I don't know how long he walked around with green hair. That sounds pretty weird. Anyway, there was a weird man. I've heard this story from my brother. My father never told me about these things. But I met my brother. My father died when I was 15, and I didn't see these sisters and brothers before my sister died, the other kid that was put into an orphanage. So at her funeral, I heard this story. He also told me that this was not a happy home. So he tried to gather his family again with the children. They had yet another child. And as my brother said, they were fighting so much. For my brother, he felt like he already had a family. And then this weird man came and said, "I am your father." I didn't know these things. And I always wondered when I grew up, why did I not see much of my sisters and brothers? I felt like I was my dad's favorite because the other ones weren't there. And I always wondered about it. But basically, this family was split into atoms, and he really did his best to try to unite it again, but it never really became a happy family. Okay, so this is what I grew up with. I grew up with a family that was affected by this. There was some level of probably very old and stagnant post-traumatic stress syndrome. Oh, I didn't tell you about my mother's family. Let's go back to that. So my mother's father was a communist, but more than that, he was a writer, and he was a very famous writer. For those of you who are Danish, you'll know him. His name was Hans Kirk. He wrote the kind of book, especially one book called Fiskerne, it means the fisherman, that it is required reading for all high school students. Everyone in Denmark knows about this book. So he was a famous communist, and that's not a fun thing to be when the Germans arrived. So he was taken into prison. He didn't go to any camps. He was still in Denmark, and he was in a Danish prison held by the Danes in this cooperation government that we had. And that meant for my mother that she saw her dad get taken away, and she didn't see him for many years. She did stay with her mom. But anyway, my parents were pretty weird in some ways. My mom was an alcoholic, and she was not stable in any way. My dad was pretty cool, and he was an economist. He was very driven by logic. He was very strict with me, and he was the one I leaned towards. I had two parents. They also got divorced, so there were two families that were very, very different. I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, what does it mean for me when I grew up? It meant I grew up with a lot of propaganda. They talked about the worker, even though we didn't know any workers. They talked about capitalism, the capitalist. And now this is the funny part, because I am a proud capitalist today. And you can hear some rumbling somewhere in graves around Denmark. They're like, we have a capitalist in the family, help. This is why I'm telling this story. It's kind of important. So also, I had parents that were so affected by the Second World War, so saving everything was very important in my family. It meant everything. It meant you do not waste food. You don't waste anything. When you leave a room, you turn off the light. When you leave a room, you shut the door so you don't waste the heat. You don't waste anything. That was also a part of what I grew up in. And then, as I mentioned, there were some traumas that were never really talked about. So many secrets as well. Okay. The other thing was that my two families were so different. So my dad, as I said, his name was Israel Grünbaum, like the same last name as me. He was an economist. My mom was educated a weaver, but I never saw her weave anything. She had a lot of kids, 5 kids, and she was mostly at home or had some odd jobs. But her dad, like I said, was a well-known author. So my mom's world would be about creativity, writing fiction, and fantasy. My dad's world would be about facts, science, and money. So those are two really different worlds. And they were divorced when I was about 1 year old. I'm the only child they have together. My siblings are from other, they have siblings, all of them. Anyway, so whenever they gave me an advice, it would be the complete opposite. So, for example, let's say I had some candy. My mom would say, share the candy with your friends. My dad would say, don't buy your friends with candy. I remember this specifically. It was so confusing. In a way, I think it was okay because it made me question everything. Whenever I hear somebody say something, I know there's an opposite advice out there. It makes me really critical of everything. The other thing this meant was that I loved both worlds. I didn't love the instability of my mom, but I loved the heritage. So I really adored good writers, and I wanted to be a writer. But I was also very curious about money. However, with the propaganda I grew up with, money was something a little bit dirty. Being interested in money, and the way I was interested in money, I really liked saving and counting money. I really liked money. And that was like a dirty secret. It was like something I shouldn't be interested in. Anyway, I went to business school with a little detour to a university where I wasn't happy at all, to Roskilde University. Then I went into business school in Denmark, Copenhagen Business School. And I really liked that because it was organized, everything was working well, I knew what was expected of me. So I stayed there for 5 years. After the Copenhagen Business School, CBS, I got a Fulbright scholarship to go to NYU in New York. And now we're at year 2000. And of course, 2000, New York, we've got 9/11. So a week after I arrived, you have the whole 9/11 thing. But that's not what I'm going to talk about here. That's maybe another podcast issue sometime. I want to tell you about what I studied. So I studied journalism, business and economic reporting. That's what the program was called. And you see, what I did here was I merged the two worlds. So it was about money, but it was about writing about money. So I kind of figured out how to get the best of both worlds. Anyway, here comes a very important point. At the Stern Business School, I had to present a book to this study club. And it was Robert Schiller's book, Irrational Exuberance. And even after 5 years of business school, this one book, I felt like I finally found the truth. Like, this is really what it's like. So this book was really, really important to me. It's about the dot-com bubble. And it's about how irrational people can really be. And I never heard anything like this at the 5 years at business school in Copenhagen. So basically the book talks about how there's this herd mentality that drives investments. So you can hear it in the title. People become irrationally exuberant, like irrational positive about the stock market, which they were during the dot-com bubble. But this is also followed by the opposite, an irrational pessimism about the stock market. And I remember when I was reading this, I thought, I know exactly how to invest. I will invest when there's irrational pessimism, and I will maybe get out when there's irrational optimism. This is so easy. I can do this. What I didn't know at the time was I was becoming a value investor. This is basically what value investing is about. So you've got normal investors. They just kind of think the market is efficient market hypothesis, which means they think it's efficient because they think people are efficient. They think people are driven by logic. And then you've got value investors who believe that people are actually not that driven by logic and common sense. They are driven by their emotions, by fear, by greed, and a lot of other things. And it hit home with me with that book. I was like, this is how the world is. It's definitely like this. I was not in doubt. And if you don't believe that people are driven by logic and facts, then the stock market won't be efficient. If the stock market isn't efficient, that means you can use those inefficiency to your own benefit. And we'll talk a lot more about value investing and how to do it in the podcast to come. Anyway, when I went home after studying at New York, I went back to Denmark. You actually have to go back when you study at a Fulbright scholarship. So I went home and I started investing, but I started investing in index funds, passive investing, it's also called. When I got home, another thing that's important is when I was studying, even though I was studying business and economic reporting, I hadn't let go of this dream world of my mother's father, being a journalist, doing important things. So I actually thought that I was going to be a war correspondent. I was dreaming about Hemingway and his wife, Martha Gellhorn, and the way she had covered the Second World War. When I came back to Denmark, I just also realized, well, if I want to get a job, at first an unpaid internship, I got an internship, and it was so easy for me to get an internship as the business reporter at the major Danish business newspaper called Børsen. So I got that, and that was fun. It really, like I told you before, I always loved money, but I felt like the other thing was the right thing to do. So I got this internship and it finished. And after that, it wasn't that easy for me to get a job as in the other part of the world where I wanted to save the world, write about wars and all these kind of things. For a while, I had some odd jobs. I worked for UNICEF raising money doing fundraising. I worked for some smaller publication. And then at some point, I started to break through. But I had my success in business reporting. I worked, among others, for some smaller publication that you will not know, but for the Danish listeners, it was Mandag Morgen, Økonomisk Ugebrev. Yeah, that was Danish. And for Reuters, everyone knows Reuters, and for some major Danish newspapers like Berlingske Tidende and Jyllandsposten. At some point, now we're at 2007, 8, 9, you have the financial crisis, and that was my Second World War moment. This is where I was like, okay, this is my D-Day. I mean, this is it. Because this was a really big thing for the people who covered whatever business or finance. I remember sitting in a cab going to cover whatever. I can't even remember what was coming, but I remember sitting in a cab and I remember listening to the cab's radio saying the stock market was dropping 10%. And I was like, I remember that, oh my God, this is important. And then the next day it dropped 10% again. Maybe there was a little bit of break, but it was like 10%. 10% was so fast and so dramatic. And I remember this is it. At that moment is when I decided to dedicate myself wholeheartedly to my beat that I'd already been covering for many years. And the other thing I also recognized was, this is what Robert Schill is talking about. This is the irrational pessimism. This is it. This is also, now I really have to invest heavily, which I did. But I invested in my retirement savings. So I told my employer, don't pay me any money, put it all into my retirement savings, all of it, for several months. And the other thing was I got a new job. I started covering banks. It was a lot of fun, seriously. It was stressful, yes, I worked a lot, but I was in the middle of it. I really felt like, wow, this is important. And it was. Okay, so the years passed by, and at some point, there's not a lot of financial crisis. It's kind of, there's still a few problems, but it's not really there. And I was mid-30s. I did not have a family. So I started to think, now what? What am I going to do now? What's the next big thing? And, when you're a woman, you have to realize, at some point you can't have children anymore. So I started to think about that. And there was just a technical difficulty. And one was I didn't have a husband, I didn't have a boyfriend. And the other technicality was the job that I had. When I looked around the newsroom, I did not see a lot of women. I saw 2 other women in the business paper where I worked. Just 2 other women. And I did not see any women, and I believe in the whole paper, not just the business section. This was Jyllandsposten I was working at for the time. I did not see any with small children. And I did definitely not. I mean, this was completely out of the question. I did not see any single women with small children. It was unfathomable. It was not going to happen. And I knew that. But I did something crazy anyway. I went into fertility treatment on my own, with a donor and all that. And I got pregnant in 2012. And my boss was not very happy. And this is where I have to not get too much into details, because then it's going to drag on for really long. But he called me into a meeting and he presented me with a sheet of paper, a calendar with a lot of colors. He was a man with system, so he put it into system. This is overtime, this is vacation, this is whatever. And so he basically told me, you're going to take your overtime now and your vacation now, and pretty much I could leave. And I did not want to leave. And I said, well, I could use that overtime later, probably when, after my maternity leave. And spontaneously, I said, what am I going to spend all this time on? I mean, now, before. And he said, I suggest that you spend this time on considering if you have the right job. He did not say it in a friendly way, not in a warm way. He was angry with me. And this was a hint, of course, that I was no longer welcome. I went on maternity leave, and I went pretty early, and a lot of things happened. I was not just pregnant. I got, some weird way, I got hepatitis, the bad one, the one that you usually get through blood, and it's not it attacks your liver, so it's really not good to get. And at some point, I thought I couldn't keep the baby, actually. It was really scary. but it went away as well. And my mother got a stroke, and she slowly died. And she died just before I gave birth, so that was not fun either. So this was not a fun time. Towards the end of and of course I had a baby. His name was Isaac, and he's born in 2013. Okay, so fast forward towards the end of my maternity leave, I was called up from my workplace, and I was told I would cover a beat called career. And this is stuff like if somebody gets promoted, work-life balance, if somebody is fired, all this stuff. And the thing about this, it felt like a demotion, because we have these conversations, what do you call them, performance reviews, something like that. And in the performance review, my my editor had asked me, so what are the 3 beats you really like to cover? And what are the 3 beats you definitely want to avoid? And career was definitely one of these beats. And another one was the free articles for the website. On the website, you'll have the locked articles, and then you have the little free ones that are just meant as teasers. And they're very short. And so I don't like I like diving into things. I like being really where the important stuff is. And those 2 beats did not really seem very important to me. Okay, so I was asked to cover career. And I was also told that I would have to work my way up from the bottom. So I was kind of accepted back, but it was not with a happy face. And a lot of things happened. I didn't feel very welcome. And then I did something super crazy. I decided to have another child. It was a big thing. I didn't talk much about Isaac, but becoming a mother was a pretty big thing. And I remember crying because, I thought I would only do this once. I remember crying. I would never be pregnant again. I would never, all these things that you experience when you become a mother. It was very sad that I would only experience it once. So I was like, to hell with it. I'm going to do it again. So I did. And this is where everything at my workplace went from bad to much, much worse. A lot of things happened. I was demoted again to the free stuff on the internet. And also I was called into a conversation which was a termination warning. I was called up to every big company has the top floor where all the important people sit, and you have these glass offices. Well, I was called up there, and there was someone from the union, a union representative, and there was someone from group management. So, and my own editor. And I was given this verbal termination warning. And I asked, well, why? And I was told, and again, I got this sheet of paper with all these colors. I hadn't produced 2 articles per day, which was something I had to, and I knew that, and I counted, and I was pretty sure I had. So I looked at this sheet, and there were these colors indicating that I hadn't produced articles, and it was over Christmas. And I was like, but that's a vacation. And there was another vacation where also I hadn't produced, and I was like, what? But of course I don't write anything during my vacation. And they told me that it was this, the goal of 2 articles per day was including vacation time. And I was like, what? What about people who take 4 weeks of vacation? And they said, well, we don't want people. And we remember that there's an elephant in this room because I was pregnant. I was visibly pregnant. I had quite a large stomach at that point. And they said, all these important people there, and it was said, we do not want people who do not produce, who are away from the desk and do not produce for a longer period of time. None of us mentioned the pregnancy. I have no idea why I don't mention it, but it was like the elephant in the room. It was like, Anyway, I knew I was not welcome. And I gave birth to my second son, Samuel, in 2016. I gave birth, probably because of the stress, almost 4 weeks too early, to a little thing with small arms like chicken wings. And of course, that's a big thing to give birth again. And you're very, very busy when you have 2 small children. A few months after, I was fired. And it happened like this. I had this horrible night. And, everyone who had children, they know about these nights. So my 2, almost 3-year-old, he had asthma and he had this cough. I don't know what it's called, but children sometimes get the croup the coop or something, coof, whatever. It's a cough that children get. It's kind of a false cough. They get it because it's too narrow in their throat. So what you have to do if they get very hot, you have to sit up some cold place. So I was sitting on the balcony with him, and he was sleeping. I was just keeping him up until he stopped coughing. And then, of course, the baby starts crying. So I didn't sleep until the very early hours of the morning, like maybe 5 o'clock. So around 7, I wake up to the phone ringing and ringing. There was 17 unanswered calls and a message that said, call me back. We have to talk to you before the other people go to work. So I called back and I was fired like that. Just, and this is where it became, it went from bad to worse to hell on earth. So I had these 2 children, very small, a baby and a 2-3-year-old. And I was super busy. I was alone with them. And then I started worrying. How am I going to live? How am I going to support my family? And this is a question. And this is how we communicate with ourselves. We ask questions that we try to answer. This is, if you notice how you think during the day, this is how the mind works. And this is really interesting. So all the questions I was asking were bad questions. They didn't give a good answer. Why me was one of the questions. Why me? Why me? And I was crying while on the baby and stuff. It was not good. And then I realized the thing about how my mind was working. And I remember Tony Robbins had once said, the quality of your life depends on the quality of the questions you ask yourself. And I thought, oh gosh, these are not good questions. And then I started asking different questions. I asked myself, what can make me grateful for the fact that I was fired? And and there was another question I asked, which was, what can I do now that I couldn't do before? Which doors do being fired actually open? What's good about this? And the answer was so clear. And it was so surprising because I hadn't thought about this. And it was value investing. And the moment I was like, I can do value investing. Because the reason I was investing in indices, in the passive investing in funds that follow an index, was because I wasn't allowed to invest in individual companies. I could do that now. And I was so interested in this. And I felt an enormous sense of joy. And another thing, I knew that I was going to get pretty rich. So that was very sweet. And this is when things turned around for me. So let's talk a little bit about value investing. What is value investing actually? So value investing is when you invest in companies, individual companies, and you look at what they're actually worth. Because if it's true that people are not driven by logic, but they're driven by emotions, then it's also true that the market will do these big swings. Then it's also true that there will be times when a particular company is way too cheap on the stock market and way too expensive. And you can calculate that. And I got super interested in that. I started learning, reading a lot of books, taking courses, listening to podcasts, reading everything I could. I was so interested in this. I did have a bit of money, not a lot, but I had a bit of inheritance from my mom, also my aunt, my mom's sister. She also died just after my mom. Then I got some money for being fired. I got 8 months of salary up front and some savings. And one of my first major investments was Apple in 2018, and it quadrupled, and it actually doubled quite fast. So this was really fun. There were other companies like Chipotle Mexican Grill. I also made some mistakes. For example, I invested in McKesson, a company that delivers software and different things for pharmacies in the US. I invested after the election of 2016, and they dropped, which they did because of some stuff that Trump said. But I lost patience. Eventually, McKesson would also quadruple, but I lost patience because 4 years is a long time, and it didn't move a lot. So I dropped that investment. I sold it again, moved into something else that was interesting. But that was basically a mistake when I look back. And there's some other companies where I just lost patience and let go. So we are reaching the end of this podcast, and I promised you a few things. I'm going to tell you what you can learn from this. What are the takeaways you can get? And also, what can you expect from future podcasts? So one thing you can learn, and this is really, really important, is to invest and work towards becoming financially free. It's super important. If I had been financially free before, and the funny thing, I was aware of value investing, I was aware of money, but I was so happy about my job. And I remember there was someone who went on retirement. I remember thinking, I'm never going to go on retirement. I'm going to work like this till I'm 80. I mean, I honestly thought that because I really liked my job. But even though you really like your job, you have to work towards becoming financially free because you never know what's going to happen. Because life is just not a straight road. And it's guaranteed that something's going to happen in your life too. It happens to all of us. If it's getting fired, or if it's getting a divorce, or maybe it's that someone you love gets sick and you have to take care of them, or maybe it's that you get sick. It could be anything. And, it's life. It's part of life. So it's really important that you work towards becoming financially free and you become financially free, because that will make you so much stronger in a situation that's a crisis situation. And for you, it's going to be completely overwhelming, dealing with a loved one that's sick or dealing with whatever. If you also have to worry about money, it's just going to make everything so much worse. So please create this safety net for yourself. Make sure that you never have to worry about money. It's going to make your life so much better. That's number one takeaway. And the only one, I made the mistake of investing through my retirement saving. And if I wanted that money out before the age of retirement, I would have to pay 60%. 60% of it would disappear. So I just left that money. I was like, okay, let's start over. So remember to invest outside of any retirement system. Okay, so the other thing is ask good questions. You remember how I was asking really stupid questions like, why me? How am I going to survive? Ask good questions. And even don't ask what if it's going to go wrong? Don't even ask what if it's going to go right? What if it's going to turn out fine? Ask something even better that gives you a solution. Ask questions like, how am I going to make this work out? How am I going to make this happen? What's going to make me really grateful? Ask questions that gives you an answer. And so that was the third takeaway. And the fourth takeaway is learn. Learn, learn, learn. Just learn. Be a learning machine. Read books. Take courses. Listen to podcasts like this. Absorb information. And also, of course, it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's also about the good things. You have to make sure that you change your behavior. You have to do the things as well, of course. Okay. And also do the work. So there are two ways to invest, and we'll talk more about this in podcasts to come. You can either invest passively in indices and passive investing in funds. That's what I did for many years, and that's fine. That's a fine approach. But if you want to get an even better return, you can do value investing. But if you do value investing, it's not just about calculating what a company is worth. And I have an ebook on my website, moneyandfreedom.com, where you can learn my favorite way to calculate that. Just go on. I think it's called Free Stuff or ebook. You'll find it. But it's not just about calculating. It's about taking the company through a checklist. By the way, I also have a checklist on the website. And you can download that too for free. So it's really about looking at the company. You have to find some kind of passion for the company, at least for looking at it. It's so much more, it's easier to do if you look at companies that interest you. And I don't know what interests you, but it's probably something you know something about. So it could be something within your field of work or a hobby or just something you happen to use in your life. Also, another point, and this is going to be, depending if we count do the work as the fifth takeaway, or yes, that is the fifth takeaway. So let's take a sixth takeaway. That is, be patient. Sometimes it takes a bit of time for an investment to play out. And that's the mistake I made with McKesson, for example. Okay, so to round this off, what can you expect from this podcast in the future? So this was the very first one, and I think it turned out fine. In the future, I will talk about how you can invest like a value investor. I'll give you tips and takeaways like I did today. I will also have interviews with experts. It could be fund managers. It could be CEOs of specific companies. I will also interview peers and clients. And with clients, I mean people who have learned from me. What did they actually learn? How did their journey go? And you would probably, for you, that would be looking at a mirror, because they will have experiences that you can recognize. And I have another area that I'm really interested in. I'll touch upon that once in a while. And that's the mindset stuff. Because mindset in investing is super, super important. Like I said before, if you believe that people are driven by emotions, well, if that is true, then you really have to learn to control your emotions. And that is what I call mindset stuff. I am a believer in the law of attraction that if you set your mind to do something and you visualize it and you remind yourself of this every day, you will attract it, basically. It will happen. Anyway, this is my podcast, and this is what I had for you today. And I really look forward to seeing you and listening and talking next week.